Tell me where would this ship be? And I thank God for the lighthouse. I owe my life to Him. For Jesus is the lighthouse, and from the rocks of sin He has shown a light around me, that I might clearly see. If it wasn't for the lighthouse, tell me where would this ship be?
Thank y'all. I hadn't heard that song in a while, and it's a good one for sure. Now, I'm sure many of you, or most of you, have heard these two Old Testament stories I'm going to share real quick. There was a widow in the town of Zarephath. Now, you probably don't remember these towns and all these specifics, but it was during a great famine that God instructed the prophet Elijah to find this widow because he had instructed her to supply him with food and water. And so when Elijah found her, it turned out she didn't hardly have enough food and water to feed her and her son, much less Elijah. And but the thing about it is, she was obedient, and through that obedience and the power of God displayed through Elijah, uh, there was plenty of food, water for them all along as the time was needed. They were in a terrible famine at that time. Sometime later, though, this woman's son, if you'll remember, passed away. He died. He got sick. He got worse and worse, and he eventually died. Of course, the woman was distraught. And when Elijah found out, he cried out to the Lord to let the boy's life return to him. And God responded, and Elijah was able to give that young boy back to his mother, saying, "Look, your son is alive." Y'all probably remember that story. But later on, there's another story. That was, by the way, in 1 Kings chapter 17. Then there was another story later on that involves the prophet Elisha. Now, I always got Elijah and Elisha mixed up. But Elisha, if you remember, J comes before S. So Elijah is first, Elisha is second. But anyway, Elisha, in this story, was kind of taken care of by a well-to-do woman in the town of Shunem, provided for him during his ministry in that area. She was childless. She was married and she was childless. And so because of her obedience and faithfulness, Elisha wanted to bless her. And so he prayed that God would grant her a son. And sure enough, this is a story that often we see in the Old Testament. This woman had a son in her later years. But guess what? Later on, he got sick and he died. So just like the previous woman we talked about, she was distraught and she sought Elisha out. And in a similar way, through the power of God, Elisha was able to give this son back to her mother alive. Two similar Old Testament stories. They were with different characters, different locations, and different circumstances, but in both cases, the dead were raised. And God worked through the prophets for that to occur, his servants. Now, can you imagine the amazement amongst the people who witnessed that? Either of those stories. Don't you know they went, my glasses keep sliding down. I'm sorry, y'all. But so don't let me bother you when I keep pushing them up. But can you imagine all that excitement that they were having? They talked about it. Wouldn't you talk about it to others if you witnessed such a thing? And if you'd heard those stories, wouldn't you go tell people? Of course they did. And eventually they were recorded in the Old Testament scriptures, and that's how we know about them today. But in both situations, God intervened to help his people. Now, fast forward many years later to the time of Jesus and hear a similar story. We're going to be reading from Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried off, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd